Hey friends, Elizabeth here from Plant-Based Bride, back again with another video, and today I'm going to share with you the books I read in February and my plans for reading in March. So my plan for February was to kind of mood read because I had a really intense reading challenge in January. You can check out my last wrap-up video, link in the card if you haven't seen that already and you want to know more about what I'm talking about. But I read a lot in January and it was very structured. So for February, I wanted to let myself go wherever I wanted to go, read whatever I wanted to read, with the one caveat that I wanted to try to focus on work written by Black authors, since February was Black History Month where I live in Canada. And over 50% of the books I read in February were written by Black authors, so I think that's a win, and I'm excited to chat about them with you. So the first book I finished in February was The Year of the Witching by Alexis Henderson. The Year of the Witching is a fantasy, historical fiction-esque horror novel taking place in a fictional Puritan time in the United States where witches actually do exist and live in the woods around this hyper-patriarchal religious settlement. The story focuses on our protagonist, Emmanuel, who is a young girl of color who, due to the sins of her mother, is treated as a bit of an outcast in her society, and she reacts by trying to be hyper compliant to their misogynistic and Puritan values. But one day, while traveling through the wood, she encounters witches, and this meeting leads to a series of plagues on their settlement and causes quite a bit of conflict within the community. And I was so excited about this book because it has been hyped to high heaven by BookTube. I feel like so many people that I watch on BookTube have talked about reading this book and adoring it. People talking about how they never read insert trope or genre here, but that this book was still their favorite. It was just incredibly hyped. And unfortunately, I allowed my expectations to be colored by all of the hype, and I went into this expecting a masterpiece. And unfortunately, it just didn't deliver that for me. I think my biggest issue with this is that the characters who were meant to follow and care for, especially our protagonist, Emmanuel, just fell flat. They didn't have a huge amount of personality. They were quite bland. Emmanuel doesn't stand out in any particular way, and she doesn't really have any strong convictions or beliefs or stances on any of the things that happen throughout the book or happen to her throughout the book. She seems to just sort of exist through it. The characters were also younger than I expected going into it. This book reads like YA to me, which is not a bad thing necessarily. I enjoy many books that are YA, but there is an issue when a novel is marketed as adult but reads like YA. That disconnect can really make or break the experience for you. You have to be able to set your expectations going into a book to be able to appreciate what it has to offer. And if you go into a book expecting adult fiction and what you get is YA, that can kind of ruin the experience. And that's part of what happened for me here. The last gripe that I had with this is that Henderson was clearly trying to explore some really interesting and important themes. She was touching on race and misogyny and purity culture, slut-shaming, discussing how religion tends to use women as scapegoats for the sins of men. But even though Henderson introduces these themes in the novel, none of them are very well developed or explored. And the biggest one that really got to me was the whole idea of misogyny and the patriarchal system within this religious community, the way that they used first the witches as scapegoats and then later the women in their community as receptacles for the sins of men to be pushed out or sacrificed so that the men in the society could continue to have the power and the control and the respectability. And this is something that's definitely touched on several times, but it never really goes anywhere. And this next part, I guess, could be considered a spoiler, so I would skip to the next book if you're still planning on reading The Year of the Witching. Have you skipped to the next book yet? If you're still here, I assume that you don't mind hearing it. The fact that Emmanuel is unable to overcome this situation that she's found herself in without the help of the most privileged young man in the society. He is the son of the utmost patriarch and the heir to the throne, as it were. He is meant to follow in his father's footsteps and become the most powerful man, the head of this community. He's the one who saves Emmanuel and gets her out of this situation that she's in. So just in general, I don't love that. idea, but from a book that's clearly touching on feminist issues, to have the young female woman of color protagonist being saved by the privileged young white man is just a little off-putting. And then the last part of this is that the witches, who are the ultimate scapegoat, they were the women who were cast out of the society and painted as evil, painted as the ultimate sinners, both to take the blame of things that were done by men in the society, but also to compare and contrast against the men in the society to be able to deify them and reinforce the patriarchal society. These witches are never redeemed. We finish the book and they continue to be the ultimate villain. There is even a scene near the end that I guess is meant to make us feel sympathetic for the ultimate patriarchal figure in this book, who is just a disgusting human being, a child abuser in multiple ways. We're meant to feel sympathetic for him and to view the witches as the villains. And that really threw me off, because the whole book I expected the witches to actually not be evil and to have just been cast out because they were women with different views or didn't conform into this society. But no, they're just evil. So that's fun. I just felt let down by this. I still gave it 3 stars because the atmosphere was really great. It was definitely creepy. It was interesting, and I wanted to know what was going to happen. The characters were bland, and I was very let down by the ending, but the world building and the atmosphere were really interesting, and I was invested, which is what made it even more disappointing when the ending kind of crumbled. I will also say that Emmanuel's lesbian grandmother is a badass, and I love her, and the only way I will read the sequel is if it is the story of Emmanuel's lesbian grandma, because she and her partner are badass women, and the scenes that took place with them were the best scenes of the book. Sadly, it was a very, very small portion of the book, but they were great. So, yeah. The next book I finished in February was Remote Control by Nnedi Okorafor. This is the story of Sankofa, a young girl in Ghana with a terrible gift that has left her with the touch of death. And because of this, she has been completely isolated and is feared by everyone around her and has lost her entire family and support system. And the novella follows her journey through Ghana on foot as she searches for this object that came from the sky that bestowed this terrible gift upon her. She has this inexplicable drive to find it. So this is quite short. It is a novella. It is Afrofuturism, which I have not read a huge amount of. Most of the Afrofuturism, if not all of it that I've read, has been written by Nnedi Okorafor, who also wrote the Binti series. And something I really enjoy about Nnedi Okorafor's writing is that it sort of combines what we maybe traditionally think of as sci-fi in the West with magical realism, and combines them in a really interesting and engaging way, at least in my opinion. So for those of you who are uninitiated, I'm going to read the definition of Afrofuturism from Wikipedia, because looking at the definition really helps me to contextualize what I'm reading, which I think is especially important when we're reading works that are set outside of our own lived experiences in a different part of the world. So, Afrofuturism is a cultural aesthetic, philosophy of science, and philosophy of history that explores the developing intersection of African diaspora culture with technology. And this book was really interesting to me. It is a lot less about science than I think a lot of people expect going into science fiction. This reads very much like a character study and focuses a lot more on Sankofa herself and the people around her, the people she meets, and how they interpret her and how they treat her based on the fears that they have surrounding who she is and what she can do, rather than how she became the way she became. And I saw in some reviews that people were kind of upset about that, or what they wanted to know was the answer to the mystery of why she is what she is and why that happened, what the object was, where she got this power from. But that's really not what the book is about. And I think if you go into it expecting a sort of hazy, dreamlike journey story where the protagonist is a lonely young girl who has lost everything that she held dear and is searching for connection and community and belonging and being shut out at every turn because everyone is terrified of her, that is what you get out of this book. And it's heart-wrenching because this is the kind of thing that happens. This book reads like a fairy tale or a folk tale, and it's very focused on human nature and how our perceptions color reality. There's beautiful world building. There are some really amazing characters, despite how short this novella is. My biggest criticism of this is that I feel it was too short. I wanted to be able to stay in this world for longer. That's an issue I tend to have with novellas and short stories. When I'm enjoying them, I just want it to last a little longer. I also felt there was something interesting there, and I'm not sure if this was a purposeful connection or not, or if it was just because I had just finished reading The Year of the Witching, with witches being demonized for being witchy. I thought there was an interesting parallel there between how Sankofa is treated as a young girl who is using this power to protect herself and also to try to help others, and how women with the knowledge of herbs were able to use that knowledge to protect themselves and also to help others to ease their suffering as they reach the end, or to help to compassionately end a life. That those women were treated as witches and ostracized and many times murdered for using that knowledge and that power in that way. And I think it's an interesting question about how we see women or feminine children and how we think they should behave and what we think they should be capable of, and the sort of vitriol that we throw at women who seem to have these traits that we don't associate with them typically. Because when men, whether they be young or old, hurt someone, a lot of times society's reaction is just that that's what men do. Men are more aggressive, they're more powerful, they have and should have the ability to end a life or to protect themselves, but women aren't expected to be able to do the same. And when they do, whether it's through physical strength or through knowledge of herbs or through inexplicable powers, we demonize them and see them as someone to be feared and cast out and ostracized. And it's just really interesting. So again, I have no idea if this was intended or not. Maybe I'm reading way too much into it, but I really enjoyed this. I give it 4 stars. If this was longer and I got a little bit more time with Sankofa, this probably would have been 5 stars because it was just really interesting. And unlike anything I've ever read, the next book I finished in February was Get a Life, Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert. This is the first book in a trilogy called The Brown Sisters. And this first book focuses on Chloe Brown, who is a Black, curvy woman, and she also has chronic illness. She has fibromyalgia. So as I've mentioned before on my channel several times, I'm not a romance reader typically. I have been trying to read more because I know there must be romance out there that works for me, especially because I'm a very emotional, sentimental, romantic human being. So it seems weird that I haven't had a lot of luck with romance. But this book and another book that I read later this month are starting to prove that there are in fact romances out there that I will adore. I just need to dig and find them, find my own little subgenres of joy. And this book was definitely that. I loved this book. I thought it was so wonderful. I gave it 4 stars. There is one thing that I had an issue with that kind of docked it for me, which I'll talk about in a minute. But otherwise, I loved this. I would highly recommend reading this book. It is contemporary interracial romance. We are focusing on our protagonist, who, as I mentioned, is a Black, curvy woman. So we're getting some rep there. And I'm not the one to say if it was good rep or not, but from what I've seen from Own Voices reviewers, people seem to be happy with the representation of Chloe as a fat Black woman. So that is awesome to hear. And also the fact that she has chronic illness and fibromyalgia is really a large theme throughout the book and is explored in depth. But while I'm not chronically ill, I have struggled with mental illness, which I've talked about at length on my channel, so I'm not going to get into my own personal history right now, but I could relate to Chloe on such a visceral level when she was talking about how she shut down and cocooned herself and protected herself from the outside world after her diagnosis because her friends and her fiance, didn't really believe her and didn't understand her illness because her illness is invisible as mental illness is, so I can sort of relate on that front. But they also just didn't have the level of compassion and understanding to be willing to support her and to support the ways that her life had to change when she developed fibromyalgia and had to figure out how to live with it. Oof, that just hit really close to home. This idea of losing friendships or relationships because of your invisible illness, whether it's a physical or mental illness. It's even harder for people to understand that you are in fact suffering, that you are in pain when they can't see the evidence of it. You know, I'm not bleeding, so it's not clear that I need help. that is a big theme in this, and Chloe is sort of dealing with her, not only the fact that she's built walls up around herself to protect herself from more people who aren't going to believe her or support her, but also that she has a lot of trauma from that, and that impacts how she is approaching her life. So that was very relatable. I felt it was very well done. Again, I can't speak to what the representation was like for those with fibromyalgia. If you do have chronic illness or fibromyalgia specifically, and you've read this book, I would love to know your thoughts on the representation down below. Also, if you're a Black woman who is curvy or fat, whatever terminology you prefer, did you feel the rep was good? I would love to know. Let me know in the comments down below if you've read it. But I personally could really relate to it, and really appreciated the way that Talia Hibbert explored that. And Red, her love interest, also is dealing with some trauma from an abusive relationship. And I really, really loved the way that their relationship progressed throughout the book and the way that they were supportive of each other. When Red was first introduced, I wasn't sure I was going to like him. There was a big question mark there. Red really started to grow on me. He trusted Chloe. He believed her right off the bat. He didn't question her illness. He didn't force her to prove it. He didn't force her to go into all the deep, dark depths of what she goes through to justify it. He just accepted her as she is, and he supported her and reminded her how brave she was when she was struggling with being able to see that in herself. And it reminded me of a very specific conversation I had with my husband early on in our relationship, where I was opening up about some of my struggles with my mental health, and he listened, he believed me, he was open and receptive and supportive. And he reminded me of how brave I am and how strong I am, and that the fact that I was able to continue through what I was dealing with, and that I had come out the other side, even if I came out the other side with a lot of things to work through, even though I wasn't fully recovered or free from what I had been struggling with, that I was still brave and strong. And just that conversation, realizing that I'd never opened up about those things with someone and had them respond with support and love and reassurance, and being told that I wasn't weak for struggling with my mental health, but that I was actually strong for continuing through it and brave for facing it every day. Clearly still makes me emotional, and that was one of the earliest moments that I realized that my husband was my person and that we were going to end up together. So those connections were definitely being made in my mind, and I loved Red for it. And it was just overall really lovely. The steamy scenes are super steamy. If you're into that, you will enjoy that. There was a lot of really sweet scenes in there as well, and character development. I did dock a star because there was kind of an unnecessary shoehorned miscommunication conflict near the end of the book that just didn't need to be there. While I understand that miscommunication happens all the time in relationships, especially early on when you don't really know each other well enough to know your communication styles or your history or your particular triggers or traumas. And they both have a significant amount of trauma that they're bringing to this relationship. So miscommunications will happen, and that's realistic. But just the fact that, as it seems is pretty common in romance, they don't just talk about it right away and work through it in a way that, you know, is sort of the adult way to handle a conversation, where if someone's hurt, you talk it through and figure out what's going on. That irked me. It was dragged out for longer than it had to be, but it was still resolved faster than it probably could have been or what I expected, which I did appreciate. And the ending was very nice as well. So I still loved this book. There is that caveat, the miscommunication, misunderstanding trope is in there, and it's not my favorite, but still, I loved this. It very much connected with me, and it's definitely up there as one of my favorite romance books that I've read. Okay, so the next book I finished in February was They Said This Would Be Fun by Eternity Martis. This is a memoir of Eternity's experience as a student of color on a predominantly white campus in Canada. It talks about her experiences dealing with sexism and racism on campus, as well as her experiences with domestic abuse. And it very much resonated with me. I gave it 5 stars. I'm not going to say any more about it here because I actually talked about it at length in my February reading journal video, where I set up the cover page for my February spreads, and then I also set up a spread for this book and talked about it in depth. So I'm going to link you to that video in the card, and also it'll be in the description box so that you can watch that video if you want to hear about this book in particular. I would recommend you check it out because this book was one of the best books that I read in February. It was one of the ones that resonated with me the most, but I don't want to be redundant, so I'm not going to talk about it again in this video. Check out that one if you want to hear about They Said This Would Be Fun. The next book I finished in February was A History of What Comes Next by Sylvain Neuvel. This was a digital ARC that I received from NetGalley, and this is a sci-fi, fantasy, historical fiction sort of amalgamation that focuses on the development of rocket science in Germany during World War II, and then also the space race, but from the Russian side rather than from the American side, with some sci-fi elements and feminist themes, and all kinds of interesting things. And this book focuses on Sarah and Mia Freed, and they are the most recent descendants of a line of women called the Kipsu, where each woman shares the same face. They are essentially the same woman over and over and over again through the ages. And their purpose is to take humanity to the stars. So this is a very interesting concept, and I really enjoyed it. I will say this one took me a while to get into because the writing style is a little different from what I'm used to. It's pretty choppy and direct and dispassionate, I think is the easiest way for me to relay it. It almost read more like a play without any set or scene descriptions, which was kind of jarring, but I realized about a third of the way in that I had just completely become used to the writing style and it didn't bother me anymore, and I was 100% invested, especially in Mia, who is definitely our main protagonist, and her journey and the people she was coming across. I think the character development in this is incredible. Even side characters that are barely in the story were really magnetic and interesting and charismatic, and I wanted to know more about them, even the characters that were arguably pretty evil. I was also so intrigued by the premise, and I was really impressed by Neuvel's research because he clearly did a huge amount of research to understand the development of rocket science through this time period. And as someone who's never really looked into it, I found it completely fascinating. I have a very in-depth Goodreads review, which I will direct you to if you want to hear more of my thoughts on it, because I really went in on various aspects of the story. But I will just say I really, really enjoyed this. There are on-tracks between the main timeline that go back in time and focus on different generations of the Kipsu, and those were probably, well, not my favorite, because I really did love Mia and her storyline, but they were incredible. I really, really loved them. I would read whole books about each of these generations that we got snippets of. Very, very interesting. I also discovered after I read the book that there's a playlist that Neuvel made that goes along with the book that you can listen to as you read, and the playlist is incredible. So I would highly recommend, if you're reading this book, to listen to the playlist while you read it. The songs are amazing on their own, but they really add a lot to the world building and setting, which was really the main thing that I felt I was missing from this, was that there just wasn't as much in the way of atmosphere, but the music really helps with setting that tone and setting the atmosphere. So I'd highly recommend it. This book definitely has a very niche audience, I think. It's a very specific concept exploring human nature as well as rocket science in a very specific period of time in very specific places. But if that sounds interesting to you, I think you will really, really enjoy this because there's a lot of exploration of identity, especially on Mia's part, trying to come to terms with who she is and what her life can be and how much of her life has been predetermined by what she is, and trying to find her own unique identity and her own unique path separate from her mother and from all of the generations of Kipsu that come before them, even though she is actually just the same woman as all of those women, and she isn't really a new person, but she feels like she is, and that push and pull is really, really interesting to read. There's also sort of a villain antagonist character that brings up some really interesting questions about who the Kipsu are and why they're trying to get humans to the stars. What are they trying to protect them from? Very, very interesting. And this is the start of a series, so I'm definitely going to keep reading in the series. And overall, I just really enjoyed it. I give it 4 stars. Again, the writing style really was the biggest drawback for me. But like I said, about a third of the way through, I started to acclimatize to it and I didn't really notice it anymore. But it's still definitely not my preferred writing style. I really do love writing that's a little bit more descriptive and immersive, especially when it comes to building the world and the setting. And that's not really what this was. So yes. The next book I finished in February was Grown by Tiffany D. Jackson. This is a young adult contemporary / thriller that is exploring the way that men in power, especially men in power in the entertainment industry, take advantage of underage people. This book was inspired by R. Kelly, and it is very hard to read. So I would definitely recommend, as with any book that I talk about, to check out the trigger warnings. There are a lot. This is a heavy one, and I gave it 5 stars. I think it is eminently important for young people to be reading this, especially young people who are at all involved in the entertainment industry. But honestly and sadly, it's not just an issue when it comes to the entertainment industry. It's an issue for a lot of young people. A lot of young people, a lot of teenagers are groomed by adults. And it's a serious issue, and it's not something I think that anyone enjoys reading about. But especially for young people, I think it's so important that they get exposed to this before it happens to them. Because the number of people who I have heard about, whose stories I've read, or people I've known in my actual life who didn't know that what was happening to them was not okay is astounding. And it's what happens with Enchanted in this story. She doesn't realize that what Corey is doing is wrong until it's too late. And that's what happens to so many of us, because we just, as a society, we don't want to talk about these things because they are uncomfortable and they're awful and upsetting. But the fact that we don't talk about them means that young people are going into these situations unprepared, and they aren't able to identify the signs of being groomed or abusive behavior or unsafe circumstances they may be getting themselves into. They're not prepared, and they can't recognize what's happening because they haven't seen it represented, they haven't been told about it, and they haven't experienced it before. And especially for young people who really are sort of indoctrinated with this idea that they must please adults. So much of the way that we educate children and raise children has to do with blind obedience to adults and authority figures. That can be so easily manipulated by people who are trying to hurt children and young adults, using that conditioning to get them to comply to whatever the demand may be. And I think that books like this are important, especially for young people, but I also think that adults can benefit from reading things like this and having it made so clear how wrong it is and what those warning signs are. There are even scenes in the book where people around Enchanted, both teenagers and adults, are discussing how they have had or had relationships with older people, and that it wasn't a big deal and that it was fine, and normalizing this really predatory behavior where adults are trying to have sexual relationships with children. This book is especially important because it looks at someone who is almost 18, who is almost considered an adult, and makes it very clear that that doesn't make this right. You can be 18 or 19 or 20, but if there is that power imbalance, if there is a huge age difference, I know that people have varying opinions on age gaps in relationships, and I understand that to a certain extent. My husband is 6 years older than me. We do have an age gap. But if you are 22 and someone in their 40s is trying to start a relationship with you, that is a red flag. I'm not saying that you can't have a 20-year age gap and have a healthy relationship, but more often than not, that does not result in a healthy dynamic, and it is a red flag regardless. And I think this book is also great for showing how people are blaming her for what's happening to her and saying, well, she's making her own choices. She's almost 18. She knows what's happening. She is doing what she wants to do, and showing that that is not the case, and that just because she is almost 18 doesn't mean that what's happening isn't very wrong and very damaging. So I would highly recommend this one, with the caveat that you go into it having looked at the trigger warnings and making sure that you're ready to experience it. It is a lot, but it's a really important message that we need to hear and we need to talk about more, especially with young people before they're put in these situations. The next book I finished in February was Black Enough: Stories of Being Young and Black in America, which is an anthology edited by Ibi Zoboi. So this is a collection of short stories written by Black authors, all about the experiences of growing up and being a young Black person in America with a lot of different experiences, quite a bit of diverse representation, and a running theme of what it means to be Black and what it means to be Black enough. And I thought that this was really well done. As with any anthology, there are going to be stories that you connect with more than others. If you want to know my favorite stories, check out my Goodreads review because I have those listed. So if you've read it or if you are reading it and you want to know which ones I liked best, you can check that out. But I think just what I appreciated the most is that it contained such a wide array, such a variety of personhood, of people with so many different experiences and identities and circumstances, and really reinforcing that Blackness is not a monolith, that being a young Black person doesn't mean any one thing. And I just really appreciated reading all of these stories, even the ones that didn't resonate with me as much. That's what's so lovely about an anthology like this, is that there really is something for everyone. And I love that a young Black person reading this is likely to find at least one story that resonates with them and represents their experience. I think that's so wonderful and so important. And there were several stories that really resonated with me and really touched me. And I just thought it was so well done. I gave each story a rating and the average was 3.5 stars, so I rounded up to 4. The next book I finished in February was Across the Green Grass Fields by Seanan McGuire, and this is the 6th book in the Wayward Children series. Across the Green Grass Fields focuses on Regan, who is an intersex girl who is all about horses. She loves horses, she loves riding, and she is struggling with her identity as a girl. What does it mean to be a girl? She's dealing with some bullying at school, and one day as she's coming home, she finds a door. And when she crosses the threshold, she enters a magical world full of creatures that are part horse, and she comes to learn how to be true to herself. So I picked this one up kind of on a whim because I was having a really rough day, and it's short, and I knew it would leave me feeling lighter than when I started, and it did do that. I enjoyed it. It's definitely not my favorite in the series. It was lacking a little bit of the emotional punch or the emotional depth that I got from some of the previous installments. But as a former horse girl myself, I grew up loving horses. I mean, I still love horses, but I grew up riding. I grew up with fellow friends who rode or had horses. That was a big part of my childhood, was an obsession with horses. So I could relate to that because horses are amazing. They're wonderful, wonderful animals. And I could also relate to Regan struggling with having a rough time growing up for different reasons, but being a kid is hard. Kids are mean. Girls can be really harsh when it comes to who fits in and who's allowed to be part of whatever group has been formed. So while it wasn't my favorite and wasn't quite as emotionally impactful, I still enjoyed it. I still found it touching, and it has a nice message. So the next book I finished in February was The House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune, and this was our book club pick for February. I have a book club on Patreon. You can check it out with the link down below if you're interested, but we decided to read this book, and I adored it. The House in the Cerulean Sea is the story of Linus, who is a middle-aged gay man who is alone. He has his corporate job, he works for the government, he has a cat, he has a house, and he's just sort of living his life on autopilot. But one day he's given an assignment by extremely upper management to go and assess the viability of an orphanage for magical children on the sea. And the people he meets there will change his life forever. So I loved this. I love this so much. This took me a little while to get into. It's a little slow. It is YA, but it does read a little bit younger. It's sort of between middle grade and YA, at least in the feeling of it. But the characters are so well developed and the characters are so good. These characters just made me completely fall in love with them in such a short period of time. This book is so wholesome, it almost hurts. Like, it's just, your heart grows so many sizes that it's going to burst out of your chest and it's painful. This book explores some really important issues, but it explores them in a pretty straightforward and blunt way, which we haven't had our book club discussion yet at the time of me filming this video, but from what I've seen in the book club channel on Discord so far, it seems like a couple people didn't really like how straightforward the messages were, that they felt kind of heavy-handed, which I agree with. I think that's accurate to say. They're pretty heavy-handed. But on the other hand, I don't think that the themes or messages in books always have to be shrouded in mystery. You know, you don't have to have 10 layers of metaphor on top of your theme for it to be worthy. Sometimes you can just say what you mean and that's okay. And especially in a younger leaning YA book, I think that's fine. It honestly didn't bother me. I think it fits with this particular book and the way it was written. And the message is important. You know, this book is really about acceptance and perseverance in the face of hatred, of changing minds to be more accepting of people who are different, and to protect all children, no matter who they are or where they come from, or what magical abilities they may or may not have, that all children deserve safety and love and a place to call home. And I think that's so important. And this book was beautiful. My heart, Chauncey and Sal and Talia and Lucy, all the kids, but those four especially were just my heart. It was beautiful. I am definitely going to read this book again. I alternated between listening to this book on audio and reading a physical copy, and I enjoyed both, but I will say that the audiobook was really well done. So if you're considering it, I think both are a good option. I kind of feel like this book was the fantasy young adult version of Becky Chambers' books. She writes awesome, wholesome sci-fi for adults that are just so, so good, that I adore. And I feel like this was the younger, magical version of that. And it was just so, so lovely. My heart. It's so warm. The next book I finished in February was So You've Been Publicly Shamed by Jon Ronson. And this was another one that I picked up on a whim. This one I heard referenced in at least 3 YouTube videos that I watched within a single week, which was kind of weird. All videos that were talking about cancel culture. And they all referenced this book, which I was surprised when I looked it up to see that it was published in 2015. So it's a little out of date, but I decided to read it anyway because several YouTubers I enjoy watching were talking about it and recommending it. And it was okay. It was good. I'm not a huge fan of it. I have pros and cons. So the pros are that I think it's really interesting. Ronson does a lot of research into the history of public shamings, and I think that history can inform how we view the current situation when it comes to online shaming or cancel culture, however you want to refer to it. He also did some really interesting case studies and interviews with people who had been publicly shamed, and I found that very interesting. The book is also written in a very approachable way, though I will say that the structure is all over the place. It is a bit confusing because he just bounces from one story to the next and from one interview to another with no warning or leeway. It just happens and it's very confusing. So I will say that, but the writing itself is quite approachable and easy to read. I did have some issues with it. It definitely felt out of date, not only because it's talking about public shaming before the age that we currently live in of cancel culture. There were some things about it that I couldn't get on board with. You can check out my Goodreads review for a more in-depth, detailed look at those things. I will say he implies that he doesn't believe in white privilege, which is weird. One of the case studies in the book, he is very adamant that she did nothing wrong, which I disagree with. And it was a bit odd how steadfastly he stuck to his position that she had done nothing wrong and was sort of unjustly canceled. It was a bit strange. He also starts to tiptoe around the idea that women are shamed in different ways and to a different extent than men, but he never really goes there. He mentions it in passing, and there are some examples in his book that I think could have been good case studies to explore this phenomenon, but he never really jumped into it. He just sort of mentioned it in passing and then went back to his safe space of talking about it in general and not exploring those gendered differences, which was frustrating for me because I think we all know that the way that women are vilified when they make a mistake is very different from how men are vilified, and it would have been nice if he could have addressed that in a book that's all about how people are shamed, especially because he also explored how different people are shamed differently and how they come out of it differently. And a big part of that could have been because of privileges that come with being a man or being white. But then again, he doesn't seem to believe in white privilege. So who knows? I mean, this was 6 years ago. Maybe he's changed his mind. I hope so. There were some cons here. So I had issues with it, but I did find it interesting. I think cancel culture in general sort of confounds me. I find it both confusing and terrifying. And I think what confuses me the most is that humans are flawed. There is not one human that isn't. And the way that we communicate, the way that we act, the way that we interact are very nuanced and informed by who we are as people, our flaws, our histories, our upbringing, our environment. And when a single comment or a single act are taken out of context on the internet by people who don't know the person, all that nuance is stripped away, and that person turns into a two-dimensional representation of themselves with none of that history available to add context to what's happened. And then people react to it, again, strangers, acting as judge, jury, and executioner without any of that context. And that's what confuses me and what I struggle with most when it comes to cancel culture in general. I am 100% on board with accountability. I think it's very important. But I do believe that there has to be nuance when it comes to talking to other human beings and exploring things that people have done. And there also, I think, has to be an understanding that everyone messes up. Everyone makes mistakes. No one is perfect. Everyone is flawed. And that cancel culture or public shaming on the internet don't have the results that we're hoping for. I don't know. I think it's interesting to talk about. I think it's such a complex issue and such a new iteration of a phenomenon that's been happening for as long as human beings have congregated in groups. It's a really interesting dynamic that we are faced with in our current hyper-connected world. And I don't know what the answer is, but this book was interesting. Again, pros and cons, but it was one that I picked up just because it kept being mentioned everywhere. And I thought I should probably read the book that everyone was talking about, even though it's 6 years out of date. Okay, so we have reached the final book that I read in February, and this was That Could Be Enough by Alyssa Cole. This is a historical romance novella focusing on two independent Black women who come together and find love, one of which works for Eliza Hamilton, hence the title. So Hamilton is obviously a cultural phenomenon. I am a musical theater actor. I went to school for musical theater. I have performed professionally in musicals throughout my 20s, and I love Hamilton. So the idea of a romance set at that time period that was adjacent to the Hamiltons really caught my eye. And oh my goodness, I am so glad that I picked it up. This one was fantastic. This is the story of two Black women who are very fundamentally different in the way they approach life, but both also very independent and strong-willed and determined. And they meet by happenstance and love ensues. And it is wonderful. This book is very poetic in the way it's written. It was really beautiful. I found myself rereading certain passages because I just found the writing so evocative, full of imagery and feeling. And it's quite short. I believe it's just over 100 pages, so it's quite fast-paced. But both of our romantic leads are very well developed and unique and whole human beings, and their romance is so lovely and wholesome and awesome and wonderful, and I loved it. The steamy scenes are very steamy, but there's also quite a bit of relationship development outside of the sexual component, and their relationship is so sweet. And I also really, really loved the tie-in of the Hamiltons, the fact that one of the main characters works for Eliza Hamilton. I just loved it. I thought it was beautiful. If you're looking for a Black love sapphic romance, I would highly recommend this one. Is just fantastic. So those are all the books I read in February. It was a little bit of a lighter month and definitely a bit more mood read-y, where I let myself kind of go wherever my brain wanted to go. I'm going to put my February stats up on the screen so you can see the breakdown of what I read, some more details about the authors and the genre, LGBTQIA+ representation. I didn't have any 1 or 2 star reads, which is really awesome. And I had a couple 5 stars and some 4 stars that were very high 4 stars. So I'm very happy with how February turned out. And now that we've talked about February, I am going to share with you my reading plans for March. And kind of like I did with February, I'm going to do sort of a loose mood ready type of month again. I just got myself a little burnt out in January, having such a strict TBR and having so many books to get through. So for March, I'm going to do a similar thing where I have a bit of a theme for the month, and I have a bunch of books that I've kind of pulled as books of interest, but I'm going to let myself mood read amongst those books and kind of go where I will. So for March, because International Women's Day happens on March 8th, and March is sort of unofficially or officially, depending on where you live, Women's History Month, I am going to do my best to read as many books from female authors as I can. This shouldn't be too hard because I do typically read mostly from female authors, but I do want to try to be a little bit better about reading a variety of female authors from all around the world and of all different identities. So these are the books that I have on my radar for March. These are all books written by women, and they are women from all over the world, all sorts of different identities when it comes to their racial identity, their sexual orientation, their lived experiences. So I'm hoping to choose from these books and have a bunch of different representations of what it means to be a woman through my reads this month. I also have some books that I started in February that I didn't have a chance to finish, which I am hoping to get to this month. There's also our book club selection for March, which is Word Slut, A Feminist Guide to Taking Back the English Language by Amanda Montell. We wanted to focus on a feminist work for March, so that's the one that we voted for. And I also have a couple arcs from NetGalley that I have to get through. So these are the arcs that have either recently been published or are about to be published that I need to catch up on. So those are my March plans. Again, a little looser, a little more leeway for me to be able to mood read a bit more, and also just take a little bit of pressure off myself. I am very ahead on my Goodreads reading goal right now, so I don't need to push myself to read more than I'm comfortable with, and I enjoy reading more when I don't feel like I'm racing against the clock. So I think that this will be good for me to do this sort of looser TBR structure moving forward. And I also have so many really interesting books on my radar that I wish I could read them all in March, but there's just no way. I don't read fast enough, nor do I have enough free time. But every single one of these books looks so interesting that I'm sure whichever ones I pick, I'll have a great experience. At least I hope so. That's always what I hope when I go into reading anyway. So that is it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to check out my reading journal video so you can hear my thoughts on They Said This Would Be Fun. That was one of my favorite reads of February, so I want you to hear about it because also I think everyone else should read it. And that's it. So thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it all the way to the end, please leave an emoji in the comments. Maybe leave a heart emoji, any color, you choose your favorite, and let me know the best book you've read in 2021 so far. If you're not subscribed yet, please subscribe. We are so close to 100,000 subscribers, and I'm very excited. I'm going to be doing something special when we hit it. So subscribe if you haven't already. Join our fun little corner of the internet. And before I go, I want to quickly thank my patrons for their support. Extra special thanks to our newest patrons, Rebecca, Sarah, Zoe, Cat Curiosities, Angie, Kai, Kaylee, Nella, Kristen, Nadja, Hannah, Carolyn, and Kathy. Welcome all of you to the squad. We're so excited to have you. If you want to join the squad, feel free. There's a link in the card and in the description box down below. And with that, I'm going to get going. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends.